Harrison Berger, a young US journalist who was on this channel before and whose videos I have published here before, he now has his own YouTube channel. And I urge you to go and check it out. I will link it in the description and everywhere. But here is his latest interview. It's a preview, it's the first 20 minutes of his discussion with the historian Darryl Cooper. Have a look at it, and if you want to watch the full program, go over to his channel and watch it there. Enjoy.
Tucker Carlson called my guest today the best popular historian in America, and it's easy to see why. Though he disagrees with that assessment, Darryl Cooper is definitely influential. His Martyr Made podcast and Substack consistently top the charts, and his new podcast, Provoked, which he co-hosts with Scott Horton, will undoubtedly do the same. This is by far one of the most fascinating and knowledgeable people I've ever talked to, and it was a privilege to get to speak with him. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I want to start with this, just your background. I mean, there's many elites who like to sit on the sidelines and send other people's children to fight wars. These are people who've never served in the military. I mean, they've probably never been in as much as a fist fight in their lives, but they're the most dedicated cheerleaders for war. And cable news green rooms are filled with these types of people. They're really overflowing. But you're someone who served in the military. And unlike our political elites, you are not a warmonger. Actually, you're the opposite. Can you explain how your military service has informed your perspective on war?
Sure. So first and foremost, I want to say, like, I'm not a combat veteran. I was in the Navy. I worked on air and ballistic missile defense systems off the coast of some dangerous countries, but I was never getting bullets shot at me. So I don't want to give that impression or take credit for that. But the what you're describing is actually pretty common among veterans. We keep a pretty tight community and kind of stay in touch in general through, just friendships and organizations and so forth. And there's been a real, I mean, you see this even against people who are the most hoorah kind of, like somebody like Jocko, who I've worked with and we have a podcast with. Jocko's, he's a pro-America, Navy SEAL warrior dude. But he's also reasonable man, and he looks back on uh, the last 25 years and says, I led men in battle and watched them bleed, watched a few of them die, and what for? Like, what exactly was all that for? And I think a lot of Americans are kind of thinking that way, but a lot of veterans feel it very viscerally because even somebody like me who, was just sitting on a ship off the coast watching this stuff happen on my radar, still know a lot of combat veterans. Like I said, it's a tight community. And so I've had friends who were over there who were traumatized, friends who were injured, friends who were killed. Um, and so we take it a little bit more personally, I think, than even the average anti-war activist, and all respect and power to them. But it's something that we feel a little bit quite viscerally, I guess. And so for me, I mean, you know, having traveled widely. So after I did 10 years in the Navy, I got out and I worked as a civilian engineer for the Department of Defense for ten more years. Finished that in 2020 and 2021, actually. And for most of those 10 years, and actually 2 years before that, so it was probably about thirteen years, I would travel all over the world, 8, 10 months a year. I was traveling mostly overseas to work with allies or on U.S. bases and U.S. Installations and ships on their air and ballistic missile stuff. And so, you go around and you spend a lot of time in these other countries, and you start to kind of, well, first of all, it makes you kind of grateful that you live in the United States because a lot of the rest of the world is a tougher place to live. It also gives you a bit of an appreciation for how fragile and almost unnatural this sort of situation of general peace, generally speaking. It's a little heated politically and stuff for our, what we're used to, but in general, we're not worrying about a civil war breaking out, in the United States, and a lot of the world that's just the daily reality they live in. But the biggest thing of all that travel is you really get to realize that people are pretty much the same everywhere. I mean, there's differences in emphasis and attitude and various things, but the average regular person, it's just when you start to get to know these people, I used to go to Israel a lot, and I probably traveled there 12, 15 times in my capacity as a DoD engineer, and probably for a collective like 6, 8 months maybe total. And while I'd be over there when I wasn't working, I would travel around. I would talk to everybody, talk to people. I had Palestinian friends in Orange County and Los Angeles who hooked me up with their relatives in the West Bank, and so I would stay with them, and they would host me. And you just get to know all these people, and you travel from staying overnight in a Palestinian home in the West Bank, and then you go stay with a Jewish friend in Israel, and you're like, man, these people they could really just be neighbors. You know what I mean? Like they're very similar people in most ways. And when you start to realize that and start to humanize the people who generally just show up as TV characters, or videos or pictures on Twitter or something like that, and you really start to recognize that, that person over there, when they're pulling their child out of rubble, they feel exactly the way you would feel pulling your child out of rubble. There's not and I think when you just watch this stuff on TV, it's easy to kind of almost turn it into a movie, even if you know it's real. It sort of plays in your head like a movie, and you relate to it like a movie. Like it's super sad. I might cry at a movie, but it's still sort of this distant hyper reality that doesn't quite sink in. And when you really realize that these are people just like you, and everything that they're suffering through, just put yourself in their position, try to imagine it, and it makes it very hard to. I'm not some like anti-war guy, like in principle, like an absolutist. Obviously, I was in the military. I worked for the DoD. I've got a bunch of relatives and everybody else who are still in or were in the military. Um, but I'd like to see us just treat the decision to go to another country, to send American kids over there to another country to kill people, to kill children. We don't send them to do that, obviously, but on that first night of shock and awe when we went into Iraq in 2003, they estimate between 7 and 12 children died that night in Baghdad due to our bombs. And so, like, let's say we decapitated the regime, killed his sons, killed Saddam, democracy breaks out, and the Iraq War was just the most resounding military and political success anybody could possibly imagine. We still killed a dozen children, And so even the cleanest possible war, like that's what's going to happen. And I would just like, to see American citizens and our leaders in general just treat that decision with the gravity that it really merits.
Well, let me ask you actually about our role in Iraq, because I was born in 2001, so I grew up with the war on terror in the background, and the official narratives around that war have changed so much. Up until the failure of David Petraeus's surge, many people were sympathetic to the idea of a humanitarian intervention that, even if Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, he was still a nasty guy and he had to go. And then even today, the conventional wisdom is that the war was a mistake, that it was a lapse of judgment for a country with a long track record of good intentions. And I think you'll really rarely hear any American public officials suggest that that war in any way reflected American power or represented how we behave abroad, unilaterally and often soaked with blood, as you mentioned. The only exception I'd say is actually Trump. He'll often say things like, we're killers too. You think we're so innocent, as he said to Bill O'Reilly in 2017.
Putin's a killer. A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent? You think our country's so innocent?
I don't know of any government leaders that are killers in America.
Well, take a look at what we've done too. We've made a lot of mistakes. I've been against the war in Iraq from the beginning.
Yeah, mistakes are different than...
A lot of mistakes, okay, but a lot of people were killed. So a lot of killers around, believe me.
Made similar comments about us with regards to China just last week to Maria Bertolomo.
Signed a paper saying that he would value Mao Zedong's value system. So there was that. And then they hack into our telecom system. They've been stealing intellectual property. They fentanyl, COVID. I mean, all of this stuff. So how do you negotiate with obviously a bad actor and trust them on economics?
You don't think we do that to them? We do.
So
We do a lot of things.
that's the way the world works?
It's the way the world works. It's a nasty world.
You lived through the war on terror. You served in it, and are one of the most knowledgeable people in America about this kind of conflict history. Just how do you understand our role in that conflict, the Iraq War, and how has your understanding of that war just kind of changed over time?
Well, we have probably other countries do the same thing, but we have this terrible habit in the United States of taking the wrong lessons from a conflict and applying them to the next conflict in a way that ends up in disaster, right? And so if you go back to first of all, to just emphasize and agree with one thing you said. I mean, Saddam Hussein, let's just get this out of the way. He was a real monster. He was not like Assad. He was not like the Ayatollah. They're authoritarians or theocrats. He was a real monster, like a really nasty guy, for sure. There are lots of those. We fund and ally with plenty of them. You know what I mean? So, but in 1991, after 16 years after the fall of Saigon, the military, the U.S. military had been going through like a real kind of crisis of morale, crisis of recruiting, crisis of image. The government in general really kind of burned off most of its credibility and legitimacy with the public, during Vietnam and just the late 60s, early 70s in general. And by the time you got up to the 1991 invasion of Iraq, or I guess we didn't, fully invade, but it was really kind of it's hard to explain to somebody like your age now, who's born in 2001, how in 1991, if you go back and Google a music video called Voices That Care, it was for the troops who were in the Persian Gulf, ready to fight Iraq or during the fighting. And I mean, it is every single celebrity you can think of, from Will Smith to Rod Stewart, everybody who was big that. I mean, it would have been like today if it was, Miley Cyrus and just 50, 100 people maybe. And
Well,
they made this music video. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say they did it for Ukraine. I lived through it with Bono and everyone.
I guess that's right. I guess
they
that's
were
right. Yeah.
abducting people, just sending a generation of young men to the front lines. No one really cared. And
Right,
just all the
right.
celebrities came out to cheer it on.
Right. And so in 91, though, the difference there was like this was not a partisan issue at all. I mean, this was just a broad spectrum, full support for the military, for what the government was doing, for George H.W. Bush, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't, and obviously at the governmental level, Ukraine has not been a partisan issue here either. But I think among the public, like it really is, even if it doesn't break down by red and blue necessarily. And so you get there, and the U.S. military, with the people that we allied with, we went into Iraq expecting, and a lot of people don't know this, the internal estimates, and we have these documents now, were that on the initial push into Iraq in 1991, that we were going to take up to 10,000 casualties, U.S. casualties, not our ally. That's just the United States on the initial push. Obviously, it didn't go that way. The U.S. military went in there and just we found out. We thought, anyways, the lesson we took is, holy shit, like the U.S. military is basically the Avengers that can come in and just impose any solution on any problem and do anything that we ask them to do, because just look what they just did to this, this military we've been building up in our heads, for so long, this military that just fought Iran for 9 years and took 500,000 casualties and ate that. And we just, if you took friendly fire and just bad decisions out of the equation, like we barely suffered any casualties at all. And so we took that idea up into the early 2000s, and Iraq is different than say like Syria was, or Iran or any of these other countries, in the sense that after that war, we sort of got into this like liminal strategic space where Saddam was still in charge, but we had full control of the airspace. We were bombing them every week, for 10 years, like all through the 1990s, we were bombing Iraq. There were sections of the country that were essentially broken off as semi-autonomous, like independent areas, like the Kurdish areas and the Shiite areas down below. And so it was just sort of this like, it was like this festering sore right in the middle of the Middle East, this place that was just a big vacuum where you had a non-functional state that our plan at the time was basically just to bomb them forever, basically. We didn't really have that plan. And so it made it a lot easier to sell that war to skeptics in the government and media, such as they were at the time, but then the American public in general, right? You have this situation here where something's got to happen. You can't just have this sort of half-failed state that we're bombing every week forever, right? And in 2003, when we decided to go in, I mean, a lot of people know now that this was not something that was decided in late 2002 based on new intelligence about weapons of mass destruction or anything. This was something that was pulled out of the drawer and had been ready for a long time as soon as 9/11 happened. And I mean, the whole WMD sales pitch itself was literally focus grouped. I mean, that's where that came from. It was an advertising agency that focus group people that came up with the WMD thing as like the most effective way to sell that war. And so, you go back to like 1998 though, and there was a period where after Clinton, for reasons that were almost entirely just domestic political reasons for him, Lewinsky thing was going on and everything, and he wanted to divert attention. We launched a really nasty set of airstrikes all over Iraq, really devastated what was left of their military, their meager air defense, everything. We really went hard on them. And in the months after that, Saddam executed something like 40 of his generals, and high-ranking government officials. And these were mostly people who were like part of his Tikriti, clique that were like, these were his people. And when you see a dictator doing something like rounding up and executing a few dozen generals and high-ranking allies and government officials, that's a sign of a weak regime, And like Tony Zinni, who's, I think he was CENTCOM back then. Yeah, I think so. He was CENTCOM at the time, but he was one of the people who was really pushing like, look, we don't need to invade Iraq. Like, we can get one of his generals who can take him out, and replace him, and then be like, all right, he's gone. We can sort of start to work our way back into the global system and find an arrangement with America that everybody can live with. But again, we took that 1991 lesson of like, well, why would we do that? I mean, this is easy. Send the U.S. military. And look, I mean, from a military standpoint, that is what happened. We went in there, we kicked everybody's ass, and we took Baghdad, and the regime fell. And then, of course, everybody knows, what happened after that. Everything started to fall apart. And when you have a group of people in a country whose primary tools are bombs and missiles and tanks and machine guns, and you tell them to police a riot going on in Baghdad, you're going to get what you're going to get, And so, I think that from a larger standpoint, you have to, there's sort of a debate that goes on even among people who follow like US foreign policy like really closely. Uh, People debate, and I see even some people take different positions at different times. Maybe I take different positions on this at different times. And sometimes it seems like there is just this implacable strategic push to take out enemies, to move in a certain direction. I mean, if you do look at you know, for all of the PR hits that Israel has taken over the last, maybe I'd say especially since the 2014 assault on Gaza, look, man, Hezbollah is decimated. Hamas is crushed. Gaza is getting ethnically cleansed. Syria is out of the way. And they just got through a war in Iran and sent the message to everybody, Israelis, Americans, and Iranians, that if it comes down to it, America will come in here and fight this war for us. And Gaddafi's gone as well. And so these are all the main secular Arab dictators who were sort of the leaders of the resistance axis for many, many, many years. And whether that is like sort of a plan, something that really is just being step by step accomplished over time, or whether these are decisions that are made sort of more in the moment based on political expediency and so forth, is kind of hard to say. I think it's always hard to say in a system of government like ours. But it is clear, I think, that things have been moving in one direction, and it's hard to it's really hard to I don't know the disposition politically of like your audience, but I'm more of like a, I guess I mean, people call me a right winger. I'm more like a, I guess, kind of a red Tory, type. And the I'm somebody who's like, and maybe because of my focus on history and so forth, like it really, I'm very concerned with things that people almost look like, it seems like most people look at as like just a joke these days. Things like national honor, things like how we're actually going to be remembered in 500 years when somebody's picking up a history book. That stuff matters to me. Like the fact that whatever else America does, 1,000 years from now, somebody is going to pick up a history book and they're going to read about this place called America that was the first to put somebody on the moon. Like that matters to me. And so when I see our country veer off the rails because, a corrupt clique of people has kind of taken over key spots in the government and media and other institutions and driven us to go really make the world a much more dangerous place, with delegitimized international institutions and tactics and strategies that, for a while looked like we were moving in the direction of them being verboten are now just sort of taken for granted. And a lot of that's laid at our doorstep. And, I think that's another thing that veterans tend to take pretty seriously.